I want to see a show of hands of how many people do know what the MDGs are. You are atypical Americans. We did polling in 2010. It's bipartisan. It was done by John McCain's pollster and Hillary Clinton's pollster. 9 out of 10 Americans had no idea what the MDGs were. The other 10%, I think 5 of them were lying, and then the others, like me, thought it was the beer from Milwaukee. The MDGs are an amazing document. Let's start with that. In 2000, the Secretary General, Kofi Annan, sat down and tried to figure out ways to catalyze the real big efforts that are being done around development in these years. What has come of the MDGs actually expands far beyond just those 8 simple goals. The 8 goals on education, on women's empowerment, on HIV/AIDS and TB. What we have seen over the last 12 years, 13 years, has been the birth of the Global Fund, PEPFAR, PMI, PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief in Africa, the President's Malaria Initiative, the Global Alliance for Vaccinations and Immunization. What we have seen over those last 13 years is 600 million people pulled out of extreme poverty. That's more than we've ever seen in the history of this world. 600 million people that were once living on less than $1 a day are no longer doing so. There are still a lot more to go. And so there are some amazing, amazing stories that are coming out of the MDGs. And it's not just these goals, these simple little goals that we want to allow every child to have basic education. Well, you know what? We're hitting those sorts of goals. We are hitting a lot of the global health goals. If you look at what we have done on AIDS, we are widely closing in on an AIDS-free generation. What we have seen is just an uplifting of global health, an uplifting of the world's poor. But what we have not seen is an evenness across the world. And so last year, the Secretary General sat down and started what would be a process. And one of the major things that came out of the MDGs and the success of the MDGs has been the fact that when these goals were created, it was a guy named John Ruggie, who was a preeminent economist and development person, and he made these goals. Basically, he got locked in a room, and the Secretary General says, let's put together some things that will actually get people responding, get people excited about development. Before the MDGs, before this real work on global development, Bono was still an Irish rock singer. He was not the amazing philanthropist we have now. It was before the Gates Foundation was even up and running and spending millions of dollars, or billions of dollars, sorry. We are this close to ending polio around the world. It's because the MDGs and the insight that John Ruggie and Secretary General Kofi Annan had to actually get people to start engaging on this, to think outside of their borders, to get people excited about development, and to make people understand that if the whole world is actually starting, if we're not losing billions of dollars billions of dollars every day because people have malaria, the world actually works better. There's less problems around the world. So I'm not saying we're in the safest, we're going to rid all of our problems. So through just development assistance, but in the last year, the Secretary General appointed what was called a high-level panel. And I have this incredibly, I would hold it up, but it gives me a headache every time I see it. It's a chart of what the Secretary General put in place to actually create the next development goals. The MDGs right now expire in September 2015. The next development goals, so the Secretary General put together a high-level panel. And the high-level panel actually introduced their report on Friday, or on Thursday. It's amazing. If you haven't read it and you want, if you want to put yourself to sleep over 80 pages, you can read it. But it has some really amazing indicators. The goals are universal. So countries like our own will actually be judged on how they are doing in delivering reproductive health care or access to AIDS, TB, or AIDS drugs, how we're doing on some of the financial crisis. Now the financial stuff is a little more, it's probably not as likely to be in a final document, but we can always hope. So the high-level panel has this report that it lays out yesterday. And then in September of this year, the Secretary General will actually deliver a report. What we have heard is that the Secretary General will deliver a report that is 75% of how we're doing on this MDGs. And then 25%, how do we build on it for the next 25 years, or for the next 15 years. So, and then there will be a parallel process. And the parallel process is, it's called the Open Working Group. And the Open Working Group is supposed to create these sustainable development goals. And this came out of the Rio conference last year. The Sustainable Development Goals actually are going to look a whole lot like the Millennium Development Goals. One of the problems with the simplicity of the Millennium Development Goals is it did leave some things out. So things like climate change was not a part of the first development goals. They are taking a look at how they can add these back in. So the Sustainable Development Goals will be delivered to the Secretary General as late as September 2014. And then we go into a period called the member state negotiations. And it is anybody's guess what comes out of the member state negotiations to come up with a final goal that will hopefully be delivered on September of 2015. And will go into effect on January 2016. These are not laws. This is not a treaty. This is not something that everybody is bound by or must follow. But what it is, it's an idea of how we are this close. We have the tools. We know how we can actually alleviate poverty. We know how we can alleviate the suffering that people have around hunger, and we know what we need to do around climate change. It's actually putting a lot of these tools into account. And so what the high-level panel did, and it was genius, it wasn't overly technical. Thank God it wasn't. We are going to, if they didn't come up with these indicators on maternal mortality. What they did do is, let's end maternal mortality. Let's get it to zero. We have the technologies to be doing these sorts of things. We can get it to zero. And so that's what we need to be working on. And that's hopefully what will come out of the next Millennium Development Goals, or be a part of the next process. So that's kind of where we are right now. Vis-a-vis the United States, I will say quickly, the United States, well, the President of the United States delivered what I have never heard of before. During his State of the Union address, the President said, "We will work with our allies to end extreme poverty in this generation. We will end AIDS in this generation." The President of the United States basically said, "I'm signing us up to the Millennium Development Goals. I'm making them America's goals," like he said on the campaign trail. It was, I almost fell out of my chair when I heard that. I was like, what? He's talking about working with allies in front of members of Congress to work with allies? Really? This is going to work out well. But it actually didn't get the boos and the whistles that most people thought, because ending extreme poverty it's kind of a good thing, right? We actually, it's something that's important. It's something that we can do. It's our our moral right or our moral, we should be doing this sort of thing. So the Millennium Development Goals and the way this administration and Congress are going to come at it is going to evolve over the next few years. So do we actually try to get everybody to sign on to a bill saying yay to the Millennium Development Goals? Might be a little tough. If you follow Congress like I have over the last few years, foreign assistance is not where they're finding a lot of cheerleaders lately. But what we should be doing is arming our friends and getting people to say, look, ending extreme poverty is not a bad thing. And making sure that people have the ability to eat is not a bad thing. Making sure that peace and security is at the forefront of our foreign policy is not a bad thing. We don't have to call the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 the Millennium Development Goals Act of 2016. We don't have to do that. A lot of our foreign policy already feeds into what the Millennium Development Goals are. We should be proud of that, and we should pat our members of Congress on the back for voting for foreign assistance and voting for development assistance. This is what this discussion should be about. It's getting us to realize that these problems are bigger than our own, and that we can't be isolationist as a government. We need to actually reach out and do these things with our allies to make sure that people do have something to eat. People aren't going hungry, and extreme poverty is relegated to the dustbin of history. So, sorry, I got on my soapbox a little bit, but
the post-2015 development agenda process has been much more consultative than ever before. I mean, one of the biggest criticisms of the MDGs was that people felt like it was something that was developed relatively behind closed doors and that people weren't well educated about the process, whereas in this case there's been so many different consultations and panels, both online and offline, around the world. They've made such a tremendous effort at the UN to reach out to people in areas that traditionally would never have any voice in this. And I think for the young people in the room, it's really important to note that that has actually really amplified the youth voice to the point that the 40 UN youth delegates at the UN, which is the group that I'm a part of, and also the My World 2015 platform online, where you can actually go on and vote what the priorities are in your own community. And they've made an effort to translate that into a number of different languages and to be able to have people in very rural areas in developing countries be able to access that consultative process. And then also you alluded to public-private partnership, which I think is one of the biggest things that I noticed in the report, and it's also a part of the executive summary. So those of you that don't want to read the 80 pages, at least make sure that you look at sort of the key takeaways from the report, because the fifth sort of major shift that they want to make in the post-2015 development agenda is to forge a global partnership for social good, focusing on the private sector and nonprofit organizations and governments and civil society. And that is also a remedy for a lot of the financial challenges that governments have faced living up to the Millennium Development Goals. So I think if that was something that you wanted to elaborate on, I think the UN Foundation is at the heart of these sort of collaborations.
One of the things that we have found, and one of the things as somebody that goes up on Capitol Hill to talk to it, is ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, is what we normally count how we are doing on development. Who's giving the most ODA every year? Well, it's the United States. But how do you, as a percentage of our total GDP, it's usually some of the Nordic countries that have higher ODA as a percentage of GDP. One of the things that we've found is, especially at the UN Foundation, and because we are working with a UN, is that over these last 3 years, the budgets aren't what they used to be. PEPFAR, $40 billion for AIDS in Africa. It's probably not going to happen on something of that scale over the next few years. I could be wrong. I hope the economy changes so much that we are not going to be having, that we can be talking about how we're going to be spending $100 billion on food assistance or something like that. But we're not. One of the things that the UN has done extremely well, that the UN Foundation has been a part of, is talking to companies and talking about ODA not being the be-all and end-all of development. It's about organizing public-private partnerships who can get at the problems that we are all working on through our development assistance. Things like maternal health, things like we have a program on mobile health technologies. And it's amazing what this little thing can do nowadays. Private sector companies can go in and have developed it so that with this little smartphone, we can tell whether or not you have malaria. You take a picture, and it sends it to a lab, and it comes back. That's only been developed because private sector has been a part of the conversation over these last years. USAID couldn't do that on its own. Our U.S. Aid for International Development couldn't do that on its own. So harnessing what the private sector wants, well, it's not just CSR anymore. It's not just corporate social responsibility, where for AT&T to look better, they donate X amount of phones to people. They actually understand that opening up markets is important. And trying to find ways, regulatory or otherwise, that allows businesses to get more engaged in areas where there shouldn't be a market or there isn't a market is one of the ways that these Millennium Development Goals, or the next set of Millennium Development Goals are going to be, are really going to challenge how we think of who's delivering aid. One other thing that's not mentioned, and it's not measured as much, do you know that the United States actually, its development assistance is overwhelmed by that of our charitable giving? The United States does more in charitable giving than it does in direct development assistance through nonprofits, through NGOs, through religious organizations that are doing amazing work on the ground. We're not taking into account those things and how they are working with the private sector to create markets to lift people out of poverty. If you go to any of the focus groups that we do, our pollsters will always say that this always comes up, right? Just wait for it, and it'll be said is that you teach a man to fish, right? It's always the teach a man to fish. You can't just be giving assistance. You have to teach how to make an economy or try to build an economy rather than just teaching a man to fish. And so that's what a lot of these public-private partnerships are about. It's the Johnson & Johnsons of the world actually realizing that there's a market in sub-Saharan Africa for their products, and they're going to create, they're going to actually try to engage with those markets on not just giving away things, but developing jobs in those countries and finding ways that they can highlight the work and get people more engaged on it. So.
And yeah, go ahead. No. Well, and in terms of the connections between the issues, the other thing about the Millennium Development Goals is they sort of look at a concrete issue, and there's 8 different goals related to different issues, but now we're seeing the interconnectedness of the issues where health impacts the environment and vice versa. Or for me, in my work with women and girls around the world are affected by lack of access to water and education. And so are you seeing a trend in the high-level panel that there's a recognition of how much sustainability and development and economic progress, it's all interrelated, and how do you assess that in creating concrete goals and indicators?
So the high-level panel created 12 goals with something like 48 indicators. Or something. I'm blanking on the number right now, but that's about right. But what they said was, and if you read the executive summary, which I did read, is that you have 5 overarching things that are actually affecting everything, and 5 overarching ways that these development goals have to be put into place to actually hit those targets. To get to 0 maternal mortality deaths, you're going to have the public-private partnerships. You're going to have access to reproductive health care. You're going to have better education systems so a child isn't married. And that's actually one of the biggest drivers of maternal mortality is through child marriage. But you have to recognize that these are all interconnected. You have to recognize that these are all universal goals, and that we should be working across parties. There's been in the last 12 years, 13 years, as we've seen an explosion of development assistance. You've seen what's a stovepiping effect. People in the development community are looking at a zero-sum game, right? A decline in PEPFAR dollars, the AIDS relief in Africa dollars. Actually, they get upset that we've seen a decrease there. But if you look at the total foreign affairs budget and you see that there was a plus up in childhood education, we have to get away from that mentality that there is a zero-sum game. We have to be talking about the total budget and the total role that companies and private sector citizens and and governments play in development assistance. It's not just one thing anymore. There are plenty of ways to get at these problems, and there has to be an understanding that these problems are the world's problems. They're not just, they can't be solved by just going into, say, Senegal and saying, well, your maternal mortality is it's way too high, and focusing just on maternal mortality, because we know that these are not just, you don't create change by dumping funds into just OBGYNs or nurse practitioners or clinicians there, midwives. That's not the end. That's not how you completely solve maternal mortality. It's across things. One thing that I do want to say before I think we go into more conversation is when we did that polling in 2010, it was amazing to see. Remember back 3 years ago, we're in the middle of the fiscal crisis. There's no appetite at all for increased budgets in foreign affairs. We asked at the top of the poll, do you want to see an increase in foreign affairs spending? The number was 42% said yes, 53% no, which we kind of assumed was going to be on par with it was our hypothesis was proved correct. There was no appetite for it. But then we walked them through the Millennium Development Goals, and we walked them through how these 8 goals can actually affect change, and how we're actually seeing changes in the people pulled out of poverty, the amount of maternal mortality going down, the amount of AIDS cases going down. We asked the question again at the end of the poll of, do you think that there should be an increase in foreign assistance now that you've heard all this? And it actually went on its head. It's 53% yes, 41% no, which blew us all away. We were like, okay, we can use that frame to get people more excited about it because, and it goes to that question that you just asked, it's holistic. It's coming at the problem from a much wider view. You don't just work on one issue, and we are blessed as somebody that's worked for the U.S. government, as somebody that has been here but traveled extensively my whole life. I know that I'm blessed to have grown up in the United States, and what we have here is amazing, and what is available to our government, the way we can create change is amazing. But it's working with allies and working together. Americans actually do understand that and do understand the value of working together across these goals to actually exhibit change.